He unlocked the front door, thinking of deadlines, numbers, the neat calendar of appointments that filled his life. He expected the hush of a large house, the polite silence that comes with empty rooms and polished surfaces. What met him instead was a sound he had not heard in months, the sudden, bright laugh of his son. Ricardo stopped in the foyer, hand on the brass handle, every step from the driveway still on his skin. The laugh came again, unmistakable, full, and entirely out of place in the cavernous quiet of the Wellington residence. It drew him down the hallway like a tidal pull. He moved without planning, a quiet impulse that had nothing to do with accounts or meetings. He found himself pausing outside a slightly open door, watching a scene that upended everything he thought he knew about his household, his son, and himself. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, small feet dangling. His body leaned forward for a moment, then pulled back, the old pattern of tentative motion Ricardo had become used to. Beside him, Elena knelt on a cushion, one hand steadying Daniel's hip, the other guiding his ankle with a practiced, precise patience. There was no white coat, no electronic machine, no jargon. Just her voice, soft, instructive, and Daniel's surprised grin as he managed, that instant, to push a little farther than before. It should have been a private, ordinary moment, a household employee doing what her employers asked. Instead, it landed like a thrown stone in Ricardo's chest. Anger flared first, sharp and hot. How? Why? Whose decision had this been? He felt the brittle edge of ownership. He paid people to do certain jobs. Therapy, he had decided, belonged to professionals with names on glossy business cards. What he saw was not that tidy. Ricardo stepped into the doorway without announcing himself. The sound of his approach made Elena look up. For one heartbeat, she froze, then smiled in the way a person does who knows that a reprimand is possible, but a child's joy cannot be paused. Daniel turned too, eyes bright, reaching instinctively for the man he called Dad, but not yet trusting the body to do what the heart wanted. "What is going on here?" Ricardo said, voice controlled but brittle. It landed in the room like a verdict. Elena's hands never stopped moving. She guided Daniel's foot down, kept her balance, maintained the small rhythm they had been practicing. "Mr. Wellington," she answered simply. "He's working on his balance. We do small steps, weight shifts, then a pause. Today he smiled so much. Ricardo stopped himself. The list of improprieties swirled. Unapproved therapy, overstepping, risk. You're not a therapist, you're our housekeeper." There was no outrage in Elena's face, only a quiet steadiness that looked like someone who had learned to answer heavy questions before. "I'm Elena," she said. "I take care of this home. I learned to help children move. My brother, Miguel, he needed help when he was little."
"I taught myself. I studied. I have a degree in physical therapy." Ricardo blinked as if struck. He had expected confusion, perhaps an apologetic shrug, not a diploma announced like this, like matter-of-fact news. An absurd thought rose, a piece of paper in the hands of someone he paid to fold shirts. Pride, stung and clinging, pulled in the other direction. Had he been blind? Had he looked and not seen what right there was sitting on the floor of his own son's room? Sophia appeared in the doorway behind him, the soft, patient presence that had always known how to diffuse his combustible certainty. She stopped, took in the scene, and did what she had always done when the family's walls threatened to crack. She softened the edges. "Ricardo," she said, not a rebuke, but an invitation. "Look at Daniel." Daniel laughed again, delighted in a sound he hadn't met much. It was small, but honest. Ricardo felt his chest tighten, the landscape of his family shifting under his boots. There was the immediate temptation to assert authority, to re-establish order with a sharp word about boundaries. Instead, something longer and heavier took hold, the question of how long he had been neglecting to see things that mattered. "You should have told us," he heard himself say. His voice carried the go-between tone of accusation and apology. The real accusation slid inward. "You have the power to notice, and you didn't." Elena's reply was simple and calm, the kind of answer that steadied the air. "We didn't ask. I didn't want to step on anyone's toes." Her humility was not self-erasing, it was precise. "Mr. Wellington, I studied. I worked at a clinic years ago. I tried to find a job after the school closed. They told me there were no openings, so I kept learning. I help when Daniel needs me." Ricardo found words along the edges. "Who told you no openings? You have a degree?" "I do," Elena said. "I graduated before Miguel started playing soccer. I applied a few places. Some places said I didn't have the right network. Others asked for more experience than I could get without being hired. I taught in the library when I could. I watched webinars at night. I practiced on Miguel. A brief silence followed. Daniel wriggled in Elena's lap and offered his small hand to Ricardo. For an instant, Ricardo wanted to be the man who always took the offered hand without measuring the ledger later. He reached and took it, and the small, warm weight of his son's fingers made something inside him thaw. At the edge of that thaw, another pulse came. Curiosity, suspicion. How good was she, really? How much had this woman, who had been paid to keep the house tidy and the laundry folded, done in secret? He felt absurdly like an investigator who had just walked into evidence without a warrant. When he left the room that evening, he left with a professional itch that would not ease. He had questions, he had doubts, and he had something far more dangerous: attention.
If this moved you, subscribe to follow the rest of the journey. Ricardo started by looking for ordinary evidence: the notebook on Elena's nightstand, a crumpled pamphlet here, a list of names there. He found instead a small, leather-bound journal tucked among dishcloths in the linen closet. On its first page, she had written exercises in neat columns: weight transfers, ankle dorsiflexion progression, fidget to focus. There were dates, measurements, and notes in the kind of hand that belonged to someone who has watched a body for months and recorded the arc of change. That notebook was a kind of confession. It told stories of countless small practices, hours spent sliding a child through a repetition because a clinic's hours were impossible for a family to afford, of using towels and broom handles and the back of a porch chair to create makeshift supports, of coaxing a reluctant limb into movement with games and songs. It also contains drawings of progress, arrows, smiley faces, the small hope of a parent who charts a day's improvement. Ricardo's initial indignation shifted to a more uncomfortable feeling. He knew it as shame. He had hired care, purchased therapies, scheduled specialists who wore crisp suits, and delivered reports in tidy fonts. Elena's methods were not flashy, they were not conference-ready. But in the end, the same quiet, measured movements she used with Daniel had been practiced and polished on a field in a neighborhood he otherwise drove past without a glance. He started to watch, not because he wanted to catch someone out, but because every piece of evidence he found tugged at the edges of his assumptions. He reviewed a week of security footage and at first saw only the literal: Elena entering and leaving the house, sitting by Daniel's bed late at night, carrying a folded mat out to the garage. Then, replaying a clip frame by frame, he noticed the steadiness of her hands. He paused on a moment when she had steadied Daniel as he leaned forward. He saw in a tight close-up that made the grain of the camera feel intimate, the way Elena guided his thigh to distribute weight. He recognized the same hands in the photos that the community center posted, hands that had helped other children learn to stand for the first time. The more Ricardo observed, the more the tidy categories he lived by unraveled. He had always valued credentials and formal associations, and he had assumed that someone who did not move within his social network was not worth his attention. Elena's existence, her competence, her degree, were quietly incompatible with the neat logic of his world. She was a person who had been educated, then excluded, who had refused to let the exclusion erase what she could do. When he began to follow Elena, quiet at first, 2 cars behind on a rainy Tuesday, he told himself it was investigation, not intrusion. She moved through streets Ricardo rarely noticed. Buses hissed to stops. There were color-coded murals on the sides of buildings, children trading cards on stoops. Elena's neighborhood had an energy of small economies and large laughter. She hailed a bus, folded herself into its bench, then walked 3 blocks up a hill to a building with a hand-painted sign: Sao Pedro Community Rehabilitation Center. Before. Inside, Ricardo found a room alive with motion. Children sat in mismatched chairs, some with small braces, some with helmets. A few volunteers helped one another practice balance with music. At the back, Miguel, slightly older than he expected, kicked a ball with careful, accurate steps. He moved with a kind of controlled joy that suggested practice and play in equal measure. When he scored a makeshift goal, the clapping filled the small room like sunlight spilling through curtains. Elena moved among them like a conductor. Her voice was clear, and she corrected a posture with a touch that held confidence rather than command. She used a wooden dowel as a walking aid. She had created a set of pulley-like contraptions from donated bike parts. She apologized when a volunteer missed a cue. She laughed with Miguel's teammates when they teased each other. When she looked up and saw Ricardo standing in the doorway for the first time, there was a steadying flash of recognition. Not surprise, not fear, but the clear understanding of someone who expected scrutiny and had learned to accept it without it defining her. She stopped the session to speak with him, hands drying on a towel.
People come from many places, she said. Most days we teach parents how to make exercises into games. We build what we can from what we have. Ricardo's first question was the most practical. Who funds this? Who authorized? He stopped, aware that his voice carried a kind of authority that in this room might be resented. But he had come with other things now. Cameras, a notebook, an awkward apology forming at the shape of the things he had missed. Elena showed him the diploma pinned on a corkboard. I graduated 5 years ago, she said. I passed my exams. I asked for internships. I sent CVs. I had interviews where they told me I was qualified, then later said the job had gone to someone who had connections, a network you have to already be inside. So I came here instead. I started a class in a church basement. I asked for volunteers. We started with 3 children. Now we have 20. She told Ricardo about Miguel, how when their mother fell ill and work disappeared, she had turned study into action. He was 2 when they said he wouldn't walk, she said. They told his mother to prepare for less. They gave us a list of limitations, and I felt I couldn't accept that as the final page. She held Ricardo's look steady, not pleading, just stating what had happened. I went to the library. I borrowed textbooks. I listened to webinars on slow internet during nights. I practiced with Miguel for hours.
When I saw him take steps, I kept doing it. That's why I can help Daniel. Hearing the details changed Ricardo's axis. It was one thing to know a fact, that someone had a degree, but another to feel the weather that produced the person in front of him. Rejections, closed doors, the labor of nightly study, practical improvisation. He felt, in a quiet corner of his mind, the sting of privilege that had never had to watch an offer slip because it lacked the proper references. "You applied?" he asked. He tried to imagine Elena in the waiting room of clinics he had patronized, polite and earnest, then politely dismissed for reasons that may have been polite and institutional rather than personal. The idea of a life filtered through such hits sharpened his guilt. "Yes," Elena said. "I applied. I did what I could. It did not change the outcome." Her voice did not seek pity. It simply laid a fact on the table, like a payment due. Ricardo saw then how small his moral imagination had been. He had designated authority and expertise for certain spaces, but competence had not always needed the same mirrors. He had unwittingly turned a blind eye to the people who worked quietly to keep his family functioning. He did not apologize at once. It would be a long step from seeing to changing, and even longer to repair. But he began there. He sat with the parents and volunteers for a night, watched Elena teach, took notes that read like an awkward translation of his own priorities. He paid attention to the way the children's faces lit when a shift in weight produced a new small victory. He watched Daniel learn to place his foot forward with the sticky confidence of someone discovering that the world could move beneath him without falling. There were practical things Elena explained, generalizable approaches that respected reality without promising the moon. Consistency, she said more than once. The body learns in repetition. We begin with weight bearing, a minute here, 10 times with a small rest. We change the environment, soft surfaces, then firmer. We use play to give a reason for the movement. She mentioned balance work, progressive strengthening, and the need for emotional encouragement. She never promised a cure. She spoke of measurable gains, more stable weight shifts, longer standing, fewer falls. The ledger of progress was a page of small notations, an extra centimeter of reach, a longer pause, a smile that hadn't been there before. Ricardo felt a growing unrest. He had money that could literally change the scale of what Elena was doing. He could sign a check and renovate the center tomorrow. He could hire staff with glossy credentials and give the center a professional sheen. But he also knew that plaster and certificates were not answers in themselves. What the clinic needed was resources paired with respect for the organic skill that had grown there.
The turning point came in a way both inevitable and miraculous. That is, ordinary in its human intensity, not supernatural. It was early morning, and Ricardo had stayed with Daniel the night before, a clumsy attempt at presence that collapsed into a coffee and sleep pattern. Elena arrived with the morning light and the soft exhale of someone returning to work she loved. She guided the exercises as usual, counting softly. Daniel reacted by wobbling, then steadying. He had been making tiny gains for weeks, each one a candle lit in the dark. Elena placed a toy a few inches ahead and invited him to reach for it. He hesitated. His chin trembled with concentration. Ricardo watched every micro-movement as if he could stitch them together with his attention. The room seemed to shrink down to the space between Daniel's knees. Then Daniel shifted his weight and pushed up. For a heartbeat he was uncertain. 2 small, stumbling steps, and then he placed 1 foot ahead without the aid of hands. Elena didn't shout or cry out. She rubbed her palms together, a private, fierce joy. Daniel laughed. The sound was brash and sudden, and all the grace any person could hope for. It landed on Ricardo like reconciliation. He moved forward without thinking, hands opening in a way that no amount of boardroom control could stage. "That's my boy," he heard himself say, voice catching. He turned to Elena. "I'm sorry, The apology was raw, incomplete, but it was there. Elena's response was not grand. She looked at him with a softness that refused to let the apology settle only on words. "He worked hard," she said. "We worked together." And then, briefly, as if it needed to be said, "If you want, I can come on officially. We can set a plan. We can measure progress." Ricardo named practical things for the first time in months: salary, official hours, a professional agreement. He offered Elena a role that matched her credentials, an official therapist position rather than the shadowed, unpaid labor she had been doing. But he also knew that personal restitution needed more than a new job post. He sat with his own discomfort and named it aloud. "I didn't see you. I didn't see what you had done." He had to mean it and then act on it. The next weeks were full of labor that looked less like drama and more like bureaucracy: contracts, meetings, renovations. But alongside the papers, real change happened in smaller ways. Elena's schedule moved from evenings to dedicated working hours. The family reorganized time. Ricardo made space on his calendar for Daniel's lessons. He canceled meetings he could avoid. He found himself choosing presence over profit in small increments that added up. He also funded the community center, not to fix it with a corporate stamp, but to support the infrastructure Elena had been begging for: a proper therapy room, basic equipment purchased rather than cobbled together, payroll for volunteers who needed income.
He created a grant that prioritized hiring local therapists and paying for travel for families who could not otherwise attend sessions. He insisted the center keep its heart, the volunteer-led groups, the music nights, the messy, imperfect play that made therapy feel like life. The local press picked up the story in the kind of headline that loves a makeover narrative: "Wealthy Father Funds Community Center After Discovery." Ricardo bristled at the simplicity of the tale, but he realized the platform could be used for good. He insisted that Elena and other community leaders be the face of the story. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was not his triumph. It was the visual proof that a family could shift its priorities and that resources used responsibly could change systems. Elena, for her part, remained careful with praise. She treated the renovations as tools, not trophies. When a local university offered her a scholarship to complete a postgraduate internship and a position in a formal clinic, she accepted, with conditions. She insisted the center keep a seat at the table for the families who had built it. She wanted a formal role in training other therapists to work in resource-limited settings, to teach them improvisation married to evidence-based practice. She wanted to help other people who faced the same institutional closed doors she had. Miguel's arc, the thread that had woven this story together, also changed. He began to play soccer in more official leagues, coached partly by volunteers from the center. His gait was steady, not perfect. He had learned ways of moving that maximized what his body could do. He had found joy in sport without the cruelty of comparison to normative standards. He became quietly a symbol not of triumph over disability, but of adaptation and skill. When he spoke at a small fundraising event, he said with the blunt honesty of a young man who had been taught to rely on practice, "I didn't walk alone. People helped me. Now I help others." As the months turned, the center's name took shape in a small human way. The community wanted something that honored the history and the people who had built it. They landed on the Elena and Miguel Rehabilitation Institute, a name that surprised Ricardo with its humility. He suggested, briefly and clumsily, the Wellington Elena Institute, but Elena pushed back. "This is not a Wellington story," she said. "It is ours. If it might have a name that the neighborhood owns, let it be ours." That insistence on self-definition, on agency, stayed with Ricardo. It was a lesson he had to learn. Restitution was not about taking credit. It was about redistributing power and honoring the voices that had always been there. The center grew in influence because it paired resources with an ethic of inclusion.
The grant Ricardo offered paid for a coordinator position, someone to handle referrals from hospitals and local schools, and for training workshops where mainstream clinicians came to learn about low-cost adaptations and community-based approaches. Elena led some of those workshops, teaching clinicians how to translate textbook techniques in environments without a room full of gear. She emphasized, again and again, the fundamentals: repetition, motivation through play, and the need for caregivers to be partners in therapy, not just observers. Daniel's progress continued in the way meaningful progress often does, uneven and real. He had days of plateau, days of frustration, days when his leg refused the logic his mind wanted. He had other days, small victories, that stacked like stones into a pathway. He learned to ride a small scooter with one brace and to climb the low steps in the community center with a neighbor's hand ready. He developed a confidence that was not given to him by a label, but forged in countless small successes. At home, the family's rhythms shifted. Ricardo spent Saturday mornings at the center sometimes, not as a donor but as a volunteer, on paperwork or serving snacks. He found that the practical tasks of helping kids strap in braces or setting up cones required fewer skills than courage for intimacy, sitting with parents in waiting rooms, listening without solutions, admitting ignorance. He discovered slowly how much his presence mattered, not as a savior but as someone willing to rearrange his life. The media attention grew but remained disciplined. Ricardo insisted on transparency about the systemic issues that had kept Elena out of formal employment: hiring networks, unpaid internships, forms of bias that are structural rather than simply interpersonal. He used his platform to advocate for hiring policies that looked beyond narrow networking systems. The Institute published guidelines and a simple statistic in its first bulletin. Many qualified candidates report being excluded from clinical roles because of a lack of network connections or unpaid internship requirements. Ricardo worked with local partners to create paid internships specifically designed to redress that imbalance. The emotional center of all this was not press releases or plaques, but the many small, intimate scenes that continued to happen in a pink-painted room in São Pedro. Parents wept and laughed in equal measure. A volunteer handed a child a toy. A clinician learned how to improvise with a towel and a broomstick to encourage a balance response. Miguel coached a little boy through a dribble with patient, accurate instruction. Daniel, now a little more confident, played at the edge of it all with the kind of ease that showed wounds healing in slow, practical ways. A few years later, at the Institute's 10th anniversary event, an afternoon of soccer games and speech excerpts, Daniel stood in front of a small crowd to say a few words.
He was older now, not cured because there is no easy language of cure that fits the real world, but strong in a way that came from practice and support. "My name's Daniel," he said, voice steady. "I learned with Elena and my family. When I was smaller, I thought I couldn't run. Now I run in small races. I help when I can." His speech was short. It did not try to be an orator's crescendo. Parents in the crowd wept quietly, not because the child had been transformed by a miracle, but because a community had finally had the resources to do the ordinary, necessary work it deserved. Consistent care, paid staff, training, and a place to gather. Ricardo listened from the back, hands folded, feeling the arc of his own change. His apology had been only the first step. The rest was daily practice. He had learned to see in ways he had not before. He had shifted power rather than just money. He had started programs to pay local therapists fair wages, lobbied for internships to be paid, and supported an outreach program that brought therapy to homes that could not travel. He had become, privately, a man who belonged to a small group of people trying to undo the quiet exclusions of their world. Elena received a scholarship to pursue a postgraduate program that allowed her to formalize the expertise she had honed in community settings. The university offered a fellowship in community-based rehabilitation, which she designed in collaboration with the Institute to train students in low-resource adaptations. She accepted, on the condition that the program remained embedded in the community, that it's not removed and theoretical, and Ricardo, who had plenty of experience with institutions hungry for PR, respected that decision. The clinic's plaque read simply, Elena and Miguel Rehabilitation Institute. It was a title that acknowledged two lives intertwined, the sibling partnership, the quiet labor of learning and teaching, the persistence of a woman who refused to be defined by the limitations others imposed. Ricardo stood beside the plaque the first time they unveiled it. He placed his hand on the wood without fanfare, then stepped back, aware that the honoring belonged to the community. Years later, the Institute served as a model for other community-centered programs across the region, a network of small centers sharing low-cost tools, training modules, and a philosophy that valued lived experience as a complement to formal credentials. The narrative of one wealthy man's awakening made headlines at first, but the real story lived in the slow spread of practice and policy, paid internships, inclusive hiring standards, and the recognition that competency does not always appear where privilege expects it. What had shocked Ricardo at the beginning was less the idea that an employee could help his son than the realization of how much of life he had handed off to assumptions.
The uproar of the title, the unbelievable moment with a black employee, was in truth a call to see differently. Elena's race was never the point of mystery. The point was his blindness and how system-level biases had kept her talents invisible to a family that could change things if it chose to. In the quiet afternoons after the Institute opened its doors, Ricardo sometimes sat in the back room and looked at Elena teaching a group of young therapists the simplest but most radical task of all, to match a child's desire to move with a plan to help them do it. He watched hands guide small bodies, watched patience turn into progress. He watched Miguel swap dizzying dribbles with the newest student and then return to clap with the others. If there is a lesson to be taken from their story, it is not a tidy moral, but a collection of responsibilities. Talent does not always arrive with connections. Competence often grows in the margins. Redress requires more than a check. It requires listening, adjustment of power, and the willingness to alter one's life to make space for others. It asks the privileged to see, truly see, what has been there all along. Years after the first laugh in Daniel's room, a child at the Institute asked Elena why she had started the center. She smiled, fingers dusted with chalk, and answered with economy. "Because I didn't want to accept limits I could change," she said. "Because no child should have to wait for a system to decide they're worth help. We started here. We kept going." Ricardo stood nearby, a man remade not into a saint, but into someone who had learned to pay attention and to act. He had given money, yes, but more importantly, he had learned to share power. The center's success did not erase the systemic problems it pushed against, but it created pathways and models that others could follow. Daniel grew, not into perfection, but into a confident advocate whose presence at public events was less spectacle and more testament to what steady care, equity and opportunity, and community investment can do. In the end, the unbelievable moment was not a scene of magic, but the everyday reveal that one person's oversight can be another's lived life of work. The shock belonged to Ricardo, because his life allowed for so many unseen things to remain unseen. The story they created together, Elena, Miguel, Daniel, Ricardo, Sophia, and the community, became one of restitution and reorientation. It proved a stubborn truth. When privilege finally notices competence, the world changes, not for immediate redemption, but for the patient, sometimes messy labor of making space. If you were moved by this story and want to see more about people who quietly change their communities, subscribe to our channel. Check the description below to learn how you can support community-based rehabilitation programs and to find resources about inclusive hiring and paid internships for those entering clinical fields. Thank you for watching.